Okay, so the title of my talk is Call Me by My Name, a kind of a play on the film and book Call Me by Your Name. And I was thinking that very often when we're looking at terminology to do with migration, we're talking about a label that accommodates a group of people by and large, and the individual tends to get lost in all of that. So that's why I wanted to look at that. And I'm just going to give you, oh, don't seem to be able to change my screen. That's strange. I'll try
you just here. Click on the screen there, Veronica, that will do it for you.
Ah, yes, thanks. Okay, so here's an overview of what I want to talk about. First of all, very briefly, I just want to highlight definitions and characteristics of identity. Then I'll look at the label of refugee, and I think it's a nice follow-on from what Jessica introduced in her paper. And then I'll look at terminological choice, and then I'll finish with epistemic injustice. So first of all, I'm drawing on the work of Zygmunt Bauman, the sociologist, when he wrote in his book Identity, in his focus on refugee cohorts. And he said the idea of identity was born out of the crisis of belonging and out of the effort it triggered to bridge the gap between the ought and the is, and to lift reality to the standards set by the idea, to remake the reality in the likeness of the idea. So here, what Bauman is evoking is the drive as social beings to belong, to identify with this and not that. The crisis can involve freedom to choose alternative identities, and conversely, the unfreedoms that confine and stultify individuals. The idea is based on an aspiration, one that is value-laden. And one of the tasks of education, I would argue, is to challenge and expand our value sets. And then I guess in turn, then the terminologists will look at how values are being ascribed to certain terms and seeing the correct usage there. One of the tasks, as I said, is to expand our understanding of value sets. And in the screen here, you'll see, for example, an image of a book called Passing by Nella Larson. It's on Netflix in Ireland. It's a big hit because Ruth Negga, one of the principal actor, she is of Irish Irish background. And so in this book, the crisis of belonging for Black people in the US is focused on, and the strategies of mixed race, those of mixed race parentage, crossing the color line and passing themselves off as white. And this book was written in the 1920s. And it's an example of such a crisis of identity and belonging. So if we look at the characteristics of identity, and I'm just drawing, Jackson has done a useful summary there. When we look at who we are and how we identify, we see that it's part of the socialization process from birth and continues to shape it continues to be shaped in diverse ways in different social and cultural contexts. We could say our identities are multiple and complex. I'm here today as a lecturer and as chair of University of Sanctuary Ireland, speaking with you. When I go home, I'll be a different part of me will be foregrounded when I look to see, talking to friends and so on. We can also talk about our identity being both avowed and ascribed. And the avowed is how we perceive ourselves. Who do we call ourselves? And then the ascribed is, how do others perceive us and what names do they give to us? And it's that co-construction of the avowal and the ascribed that brings us to in a communicative terms, an understanding of identity. And when we're looking at terminology and labels, the ascribed identities obviously play a key role there. Our identities are variable in salience and intensity, depending on the context we find ourselves, and they can be expressed verbally and non-verbally, and this was touched upon in the last talk. So if we look at the types of identity, and if we look in sociological terms, we can, first of all, moving out from the personal, the individual, who is named at birth by the parents, then we can say, you know, for example, in what social milieu have they been born into, what national identity do they have, what racial and ethnic identity, what cultural class, etc., etc. So the list of attributes and types of identity, we, you know, can go on. And one of them is legal versus illegal, you know, in terms of identity. Okay. So if we look now at labels, and this was mentioned earlier in Jessica's work, the turning to the Cambridge Dictionary definition of label, they say it's a word or phrase that is used to describe the characteristics or qualities of people, activities, or things, often in a way that is unfair. For example, he seems to be stuck with the label of troublemaker. So I want to explore this a little bit more. And I'm drawing on, first of all, Kwame Anthony Appiah, who is a moral philosopher, and he says that once labels are applied to people, ideas about people who fit the label come to have social and psychological effects. So this comes back to that notion of the ascription, the avowed and the ascribed. And then drawing on another paper by Navarro Vigil and Bailey Abidi, these are two researchers, one of them with a refugee background, the other somebody who was working with an NGO in refugee context. And they've written a really nice paper called We the Refugees, which I reference throughout here. And they say the contemporary refugee label, which attempts to group together an extraordinary heterogeneous population of people, fails to nuance the diverse historical, social, political, and cultural contexts that drive forced migration. So as we can see, the individual is lost in that in that grouping or that label. And it's very poignant when I look at this image here and I think of what has happened, you know, the tragedy at sea near Calais yesterday. You know, I prepared this a few days ago, and so I want to, you know, pay respect to those who have suffered, and also to remind ourselves that for each individual who was lost at sea, they have their family, their friends, others, people who were perhaps waiting for them in the UK to receive them, and people who helped send them on the way. There's also, I know a lot of focus is on the smugglers at the moment, that's where the problem is, but I would see that the problem is more systemic than that. And, you know, there are other questions that need to be asked. So looking back into the 1940s and the work of Hannah Arendt, who was forced to leave Germany because of her Jewish background, that identification, she has written an essay called We Refugees. It's quite short. I recommend you to look at it. And I've just taken a few quotes from it, which I think help to underscore the sense of identity that the individual has, and when they're forced into a new environment, you know, having to take on new identities. And she says, in the first place, we don't like to be called refugees. We ourselves call each other newcomers or immigrants. And why is that? Because she said refugee, the term in its original instance was for people who were forced to flee due to perhaps having spoken out against the state, being a troublemaker, somebody who had committed a crime and they were fleeing. And in the earliest cases of places of sanctuary, churches and cities in medieval times became places of sanctuary for people who were forced to flee. So she says the Jewish emigres, they haven't done anything wrong. So the label refugee is not one that I wish to identify by. And she says, we wanted, when we came to the new land, we wanted to rebuild our lives. That was all. You know, in other words, we don't want to feel that we are a threat to the host community. And also, once we were somebodies about whom people cared, we were loved by friends and even known by landlords as paying our rent regularly. Once we could buy our food and ride on the subway without being told we were undesirable. I'm now turned back to the work of Navarro Vigil and Bailey Abidi, and they talk about, in a similar vein, about being a refugee, and their paper is, so Hannah Arendt's paper is called We Refugees, and their paper is We, in inverted commas, the refugees. So they are focusing on the we, that pronoun, collective pronoun aspect there. And they say, from my experience, refugee is a status that, within the current panorama of world migration and immigration, is unique. Once this category or status is bestowed upon a person, it is never lost. So in other words, when we're looking at the label and the identification, there is that mark, that stamp on the individual, which is very hard to shift. And they talk about it meaning, it means being in a factual struggle for freedom and dignity. So trying to escape that prescriptive label of refugee with all its connotations is a struggle for the freedom and the dignity that one wishes to have in society. They also say it's the archetype for the 21st century, if not of humanity itself. And then there is, in the final one, there's a claiming I am a refugee. Others look at me and see a refugee. I look at myself through others' eyes and become a refugee. The notorious cycle of self is complete. So there's that iteration again, the going back and forth between the avowed and the ascribed. So I come back to the work of Bauman again, and he talks about identity spaces in relation to refugees. And he says another category that is meeting the same fate as the underclass are the refugees, the stateless, the sans-papiers, the non-territorials in a world of territorially grounded sovereignty. While sharing the predicament of the underclass, they are, on top of all the other deprivations, denied the right to a physical presence within the territory under sovereign rule, except in specially designed non-places, labelled as refugee or asylum seeker camps, to distinguish them from the space where the rest, the normal, the complete people live and move. And here I have an example for those who are not in Irish people on this conference might recognize these images. They're of a direct provision centre, the term that we use to accommodate people who have sought asylum in the country. And these are in Athlone, and they're taken by the photographer Vukasin Nedeljkovic, who has created an asylum archive. And these non-places, these limbo states, are ones that are often tucked away out of the society's view. However, coming back to Navarro Vigil and Bailey Abidi, they talk about new spaces. So they're kind of trying to look at positives in it. And they say we delve into the points where self-identification negotiates with labeling in order to conceptualize the notion of new spaces. So the fact that the two of them are coming together, one of them from the host community, the other from the guest, as it were, the host and guest meeting, and trying to fashion a new we out of the us and out of the them, out of the othering techniques that are there. And this kind of, I think, echoes nicely Arendt's her comment in her essay, where she says, in order to build one's life, one has to be strong and an optimist. So we are very optimistic. And I think this is very useful to look at when we're thinking. Often the term refugee or asylum seeker, people think of somebody who is lost, someone who is vulnerable, somebody who needs our help. There is that charity aspect to it. Whereas here there is a claiming of individual resilience and strength, having one's voice and being able to, if one finds in these new spaces the opportunity to use the voice. And this kind of relates to the notion of epistemic justice, who gets to speak about oneself? Do others speak on my behalf? Can I claim a space at the table to identify who I am? So I want to look now at terminology, and this is where I mentioned at the start when I spoke with Pat, and I was mentioning that the term, for example, asylum seeker, is one that is considered by many in the migration field to be, it has lost its traction, or it's the connotations are negative. So we need to have a new name, a new label in order to think about people who are identified as such in new ways. So, for example, the term that is being used now, and that was recommended by the UNHCR and by NGOs, is international protection applicant. It's a bit of a mouthful. Asylum seeker is much easier to say. And, sometimes I struggle. I started last year in trying to bring this new terminology in, and also with our students on our masters in refugee integration. And often it can be the acronym IPA can be used, but acronyms really don't, I think they're a worse label than a term like asylum seeker in some regards. However, the notion of protection applicant is one where we're shifting from the asylum seeker, somebody who is desperate, who is lost, who needs our help, to somebody with ascribed dignity in a legal setting. They have come to the state, and they are looking for the Geneva Convention protocols to be enacted on their behalf. So we can see that the identification, that ascription, shifts our understanding of their identity. People, if we look at refugees, there is now again a move to talk about people with refugee-like backgrounds. And why this? Because when we're talking about a refugee, you've got program refugee, convention refugee, somebody with subsidiary protection, somebody with leave to remain, somebody who's in the protection application process. The word refugee can, on its own, is quite reductive. So bringing in the refugee -like can help to open up that space a little bit. Another one that is used, and I was really disappointed to see, I was attending a webinar yesterday, and a member of our National Immigration Service who police the airport in Dublin was referring to people coming in seeking asylum as non-nationals. The term has, been shifted now, and it's considered better to talk about a foreign national, because the notion of non-national, it means that it's a deficit model. It's one that you do not have any nationality. In other words, you are without. Some people are without papers, but they would have an originary. Or the term third country national is used, which again, I think is quite a cumbersome term, but maybe Jessica, who works in the Commission, might have something to say about that. And then economic migrants is another label that triggers waves of rejection, oh, they're only coming to, they're not deserving migrants. They're not fleeing persecution. They're just coming to improve their lives. Why should we allow them to come in? So instead of talking about economic migrants, there is a preference to talk about migrants or newcomers. So we can just see there's shifts all the time. And in the questions to the last paper, there were questions asked, why do we continue to do that? So another paper that I draw on is one to do with semiotics, and it's the work by Cole, and she says it might be helpful to bring some semiotic considerations to bear when we're trying to understand the shifting sands of terminology in this contested field. And she says semiotic considerations can help to acknowledge the importance of an initial shared meaning of a label to facilitate and secure cooperation between various relevant actors, and also to recognize that the label can potentially convey several very different meanings, both longitudinally and simultaneously, depending on the perspectives of the various stakeholders involved. So here, if we look at when Hannah Arendt talked about we refugees, and she said, I don't identify as a refugee because in that longitudinal sense, refugee had a different connotation. So I'm not going to go into detail here. Some of you are, maybe are very familiar with semiotics, but I'm just drawing on, Cole draws on the work by Barth to looking at, the first order and second order signification. So if we're taking a term, which is the sign, and we look to see who is the signifier, and then what is signified. So if we take the label refugee, the signifier would be the individual who is fleeing persecution, for example, and then the signified, what meaning is ascribed then to that label. So if we look in that primarily in the first order view, we could take as an example the 1951 convention, which is the Geneva Convention to do with refugees, which was coined or drafted in the aftermath of the Second World War. And so this protects refugees. It defines a refugee as a person who is outside his or her country of nationality or habitual residence, has a well-founded fear of being persecuted because of his or her race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, and is unable or willing to avail him or herself of the protection of that country or to return there for fear of persecution. This has been amended since, but not too much, in 1967, where it removed the 1951, sorry, not the 1950, it removed earlier time sensitive clauses in it. And so this is, as I said, the first order definition. But if we take refugee and see how it is understood today. So if we look at the second order, the term refugee, the sign refugee, shifts from the first order of significance, that is from its literal meaning, to become the signifier itself. It becomes the form, and the signification then changes. You have new concepts appearing, disappearing, expanding, contracting. As we know, as as humans, we're very creative. We're always looking for new ways of looking at things. Our contexts change, and therefore our language often accommodates these changes. And it's what Barth talks about as an interpretive slide. And Cole says that over time and entering different spaces, individuals may seamlessly slide between the different order of meaning due to the personal circumstances, political intent, and socio-historical conditions. And if you look down at the bottom left of the screen, there is the eponymous image of the family in flight that was originally designed to warn drivers in the United States that there were people, running, had just crossed the border, and, be careful, you might kill them, you might run them down. And this then, this label was taken up, this semiotic was taken up by anti-immigration vigilantes, and seeing this as a threat rather than something to be careful about. And then in the second image, you've got Banksy.
I'm sorry to intervene. I'm
my
sorry.
time.
Yes. I sent you a message, but you didn't notice.
Oh, I can't see any messages because I'm on full screen. Yes. Sorry, I'm almost at the end, so sorry about that. So I just wanted to finish on the term epistemic injustice. And Vigil and Abidi, they say the label of other and the label of refugee come together to illustrate distinctiveness from mainstream society. The label of other often stems from contrived and discriminatory narratives, which privilege those in power. Spivak named this process the epistemic violence of othering. And in a similar vein, Miranda Fricker, who has a book called Epistemic Injustice, she says testimonial injustice occurs when prejudice causes a hearer to give a deflated level of credibility to a speaker's word. Hermeneutical injustice occurs at a prior stage when a gap in collective interpretive resources puts someone at an unfair disadvantage when it comes to making sense of their political experiences. So their time doesn't allow, so I just wanted to flag that. Epistemic injustice occurs. If we're looking at terminological adaptations, we could see that they can play a role in establishing epistemic justice. So in conclusion, we've looked at identity politics, where the individual and their understanding of themselves, their role in society, their collective identities that make them up we must keep that in mind. We have the inescapable reality of labels and how we can contest those. We can look also at the fluidity of signs, signifiers, and significations. And finally, that we must always strive for epistemic justice in the work we do as academics, as educators, as civic society citizens.